Today we're talking about one of the best weapons in the entire game, the Potshot. This weapon can dish out millions of damage with no setup whatsoever. In these best perks videos, where I show you the best perks that you might want to be running, I typically cover loadouts that improve these weapons, but Demolitionist Penny is like the only launcher hero in the entire game, and you don't even need her. The Potshot is an excellent weapon because it dishes out so much damage without any setup whatsoever. If you're running Totally Rockin' Out and wafers to activate it as soon as you want, that can be really, really good because critting more often is great, but it does not need any of that support. And that's because the Potshot, since release, has been bugged. It just does double damage sometimes. The exact formula is on the screen. Thank you, AS407. We're not really sure yet when it activates that extra damage, but it's often enough to make it viable as a very, very strong weapon. So if you're going up against a mini boss or mist monsters or a smasher and you want to do big damage right now, the Potshot is a great pick. That is kind of what I use it for. In fact, if you can see my copies here, I have all the different elements except for energy. I use physical because physical mini bosses are super common. I have all the different elements because elemental mini bosses exist. If it's a fire mini boss, I pull out my nature Potshot, and I am very often running Totally Rockin' Out. I said I wouldn't do a loadout overview, but it is just quick enough to show you what that kind of looks like. So Totally Rockin' Out increases your crit rating by a ton. That makes you crit a lot more often. And then I'm always running heroes like Battle Beat, which are, just getting active from regular kills, or as mentioned, sub wafers, where I can just eat a wafer and then start using the Potshot, and it'll do tons of damage with my normal builds, and that is just really, really useful. People use the Potshot in the Mythic Storm King fight all the time because of its long range capabilities. It does activate in proximity, so it's not really good for crowd clearing. If you shoot it into a horde of enemies, it's usually just going to explode on the first one and not do that much, so it is not an everything weapon. The Potshot is very specifically for single targets, typically mini bosses as mentioned, or mist monsters. On that note, I won't actually recommend it for the Storm King end phase. Anybody who's used this in the Storm King fight knows that the Potshot does a ton of damage, but it does a ton of damage more in range of a mini boss's health. For big targets like the Storm King, or specifically smasher models like regular smashers or smasher mini bosses, the plasmatic discharger is actually significantly stronger. So if you are using the Potshot versus a smasher model enemy, you might actually want to consider using the plasmatic discharger. I'll link the best perks for that in the video description down below. You should definitely check that out because both of these weapons are very fantastic for mini boss slaying. That said though, however, the end phase for the Storm King is kind of reserved for the discharger, but the Potshot is going to be excellent for those mini bosses. Now, if you're actually perking this thing, you're not going to see any surprises. A crit build is kind of the best thing to go for. In my original video that was many years ago, I actually favored the idea of a double or triple damage version of this. However, I was flawed in my logic because the idea that triple damage is going to reduce the amount of shots to kill is kind of wrong. If you're going up against an enemy like a blaster or a taker, they typically have enough health where they're dying to 2 shots pretty much no matter what. If you crit, they'll die in 1 shot, but 2/3 of the time you're not really critting, so it might take 2 or 3 shots to kill those targets. Smashers are going to take anywhere in the neighborhood of like 5 or 6 shots if it's a damage perk, but if you're firing 5 or 6 shots using triple or double damage, you probably would have crit by then anyway. You see where my logic was a little flawed there? If it takes 3 shots on average to kill an enemy with a damage perked weapon, with a 38% chance to crit, on average, not universally, generally you would have crit by then anyway. So if you're going to be spamming shots regardless, in fact, a lot of people who run MSK are using double Potshot, and that's a great strategy, you're kind of fishing for crits whether or not you even know it. And as painful as it is to say, you do want to run a crit build on this. It's boring. I don't like shooting a single target weapon that might not crit most of the time. If you're running Totally Rockin' Out, then this problem is alleviated. You will be critting most of the time. And if you are always running Totally Rockin' Out, or if you're running MSK and you know you're going to be running that team perk that buffs your crit chance, you actually could run double crit damage. That's a really viable build if you are running Totally Rockin' Out. Normally, as I showed with my copies here, all of them are crit damage because it's just the consistent, boring option, and you definitely want reload. The reload speed on this is super slow. On the left-hand side, I am recording this during a bug in the game where every weapon says 1 second reload. That is not accurate, but suffice it to say, you do want that reload perk because getting more shots off is very important, and a mag size will help, but you're eventually going to have to reload, and that just maximizes your downtime. Typically in a situation where you're pulling out a Potshot, you want to kill the enemy quickly, get back to your normal weapon, get back to the defense, get back to playing normally. A slow reloading mag size is not typically preferred. That's my preference though. If you're running Chaos Agent, for example, you can alleviate that reload speed by throwing a grenade or phase shifting, but you're only firing 2 or even like 3 shots with a mag size. I think the mag size is 3 or 4 shots. If it is 4 shots, even still, that's It's pretty slow firing. That's a long time to get through the mag, and then reloading with that it's not good. I don't think that's necessarily recommended, because the Potshot is an interesting recommendation. When I'm talking about this weapon, it's not your primary. It's not the only weapon you're using. It's really not even being used for most of the mission. You're only specifically using it for big targets like Mist monsters and bosses. So I recommend a reload perk, but you can choose from there. For the element, I recommend all of them. I know. It's not fair to suggest to new players that you get 4 copies of the Potshot, but if there is any weapon worth your flux, this is definitely one of the top recommended ones. I have a whole video on how to spend your flux, linked in the description down below. The Potshot is one of my key recommended ones. If you only have 1 copy, I do believe physical is best. Especially if you're running the Mythic Storm King fight, those mini bosses can only be physical, and that's something to consider. So you might have multiple different elemental weapons for different mini bosses that can exist. There are lots of different ones. They can be all the elements though. So physical is kind of the safest. It'll just do the most damage and be the most consistent for the targets that you're going up against. But yes, the true final form of this weapon is having 4 copies. I didn't have 4 copies up until like only a few months ago, but physical is where you should start, and then every element from there. One thing you can consider, little warning on the flashbang here, is the yearly content timeline. I mention this in almost all of my videos because it's super useful, and it's linked in the description down below in every single one of my videos. On the far right hand side here, I actually have listed the element for every single season. You can see for entire months of the year, we have nature, we have fire, we have water. If you are playing during one of these seasons, like the water season, you can, actually down here is the water season, you can just make your Potshot nature for that specific season, and then switch it to water for the fire season, switch it to fire for the nature season. And then during these seasons where it can be any element, then you can make it physical. Granted, that is only affecting like 4-player missions and smashers. Blasters and takers are always physical. A reminder that the Storm King mini bosses are always physical as well. And then it's just the mini bosses that don't really care what season it is anyway. So if you're in a fire season, the mini boss can still be whatever element it wants. So that's why if you only have 1 copy and it's going to stay that way for a while, there's a lot to consider with what element you want to run. Just talk to yourself and ask yourself, hey, what am I using this weapon for? Am I using this for mini bosses? Am I using this for the regular smashers? Am I using this for regular mist monsters? And think about this. If you are only using your Potshot for mini bosses specifically, you could probably craft a physical copy, change the element, craft another one, change the element, and craft another one, and you'll actually look a little something like this. I've been doing that with my 4 copies, and it actually takes a really long time to break these. So that's a pretty expensive way to operate. If you really don't want to get another copy, it's kind of a niche suggestion, but yeah, you can just craft several elemental copies. It's possible. They last a good long time if you're only saving them for mist monsters, but it's just something to consider. Now, all right, I've done a lot of talking in this video, and I haven't even gotten to these bottom perks because I feel like it's kind of self-explanatory, but of course I got to go over it. Damage to mist monsters bosses is excellent. That is the only target you really have with a Potshot. If you're being lazy and wasteful, you might use this versus regular targets. You can do whatever you want. Hey, it's your Potshot, but I personally am only targeting mist monsters with this thing, and bosses, of course. And this damage is, I believe it's actually doubled in the Storm King fight. Don't quote me on that. It's a bug. It might get fixed in the future, but it just does a lot anyway. So even though you should already be using it, definitely use it in the Storm King fight. Some people prefer fire rate. I don't blame you. Shooting faster is nice. If you want to get more shots off, that's great, but I think the better damage per shot is definitely preferred. And then the final 6 perk. Affliction, in my opinion, is the absolute best. You do not want to be wasting tons of ammo shooting the same target over and over and over and over, even though you will sometimes be doing that. Affliction would be really good for just extra damage while you're getting those shots off. It's a slow firing weapon that has a little bit of time to reload. You will have plenty of time for Affliction to do tons of extra, and your alternatives are not that good. One, you're not going to want to snare. I guess it can make sense to shoot a smasher or mini boss and watch him be slow, but the snare doesn't work on mini bosses anyway, and the smashers, they're going to go through walls whether they're snared or not, and you don't want to be standing still. If you're one of those players that just stands up on the base and maybe you're staying on a healing pad or something, standing still can maybe make sense. There is a lot of damage to be gained from these 6 perks. You can look at your playstyle and decide if that's right for you. I can't sit still. I have ADD when I play this game. I am always moving, and Affliction is tons of extra damage anyway. That's my pick 100%. Especially in the Storm King fight, you should not be standing still for 10 seconds. That is absolutely not recommended, but if you are playing a defensive mission where you're hanging back, the traps are doing their job, maybe you're a more relaxed player than I am, you could benefit a ton from standing in place, and a 55% damage bonus is huge. 17% times 5 is a lot of damage for mist monsters, even more than the 55% for the damage. So there are 2 very good options if you're playing slow, but I don't really recommend that. I guess it's fair to note that the Potshot doesn't really have any damage drop off, so You can do that. It just doesn't work for me and it's hard to think about it, but I'm trying to make this video available to everybody, and that might work for you. As for the max shield, I don't think you need that. We're trying to do big damage here, not stay alive. Throw a campfire down if you're sitting still. You don't need that. I think these two are the only other options beside Affliction, and personally I favor Affliction, but you can pick what works best for you. So there you go. There's a Potshot best perks. Definitely wanted to update my old video because I didn't lean as hard on crit as I should, and I've definitely embraced it now. As mentioned, I saw the flaw in my ways, and this weapon is one of the best in the entire game. So to have such an old, outdated video when I don't even have a specific video showcasing the Potshot, I mention it all the time, but it doesn't even have its own video that's not 3 years and outdated. So yeah, there's the new one. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe if you're new. Check out the Potshot if you haven't already. If you made it to the end of this and you don't have the weapon, then I guess you're enjoying the videos and you're going to want to check out one of these recommended ones here at the end. And then